everyone, and welcome to today's webinar. This is the Interpersonal Othering and Belonging webinar. My name is Jordan Crumroy, and I'm the Senior Regional Manager at Welcoming America. While folks are coming in to the Zoom room, I encourage you to introduce yourself in the chat, maybe share where you're calling in from or zooming in from today. We'd like to note that the webinar is being recorded and you will receive a recording link sent to you in the following days. So again, encourage you to introduce yourself in the chat and let us know where you are calling from. So Anthony, if you'll go to the next slide, I want to give a little bit of information about Welcoming America and where this webinar is situated within our work. So if you aren't familiar with Welcoming America, we are a nonprofit organization. We help local communities become more welcoming places where everyone can belong. And one of the ways that we do that is by lifting up promising practices from the field and sharing those with practitioners on the ground. Of course, you can find more resources on our website, welcomingamerica.org, and read about how to become a member so that you'll have full access to resources like today's webinar. So Anthony, if you'll take us to the next slide. So today's webinar is part of the Fostering Belonging Individually and Structurally series. And this series features 3 webinars and accompanying videos on belonging, what it means, what it looks like, and how we can create belonging as individuals with structural impact. Hosted by Welcoming America, the videos feature prominent leaders and experts on fostering belonging in communities. And you'll see that each video is accompanied by webinars that explore how do we combat othering in our personal relationships, in group interactions, and in our environment and systems. And of course, today, this is the second webinar of that series. The training series is all connected to Belonging Begins With Us, a campaign that's dedicated to fostering a nation where everyone can belong. And you can learn more about that campaign at belongingbeginswithus.org. Anthony, if you'll take us to the next slide, you can see here at the very top the link if you'd like to view the films. You can also view the past webinar and our future webinars at that link as well. So the first webinar happened actually last week, and this was an introduction to the field of othering and belonging. Welcoming America's Executive Director, Rachel Parrish, facilitated a discussion with experts from local government, academia, and also the YMCA of USA. And that webinar is supported by a short film featuring John A. Powell, the director of the Othering and Belonging Institute at UC Berkeley. Of course, today's webinar will feature ways that intergroup and interpersonal othering can be combated with examples from quite a different variety of presenters. And today's webinar is accompanied by a film from John Sarrouf, the co-executive director of Essential Partners. So if you haven't seen that film, it's not too late. You can go to the link at the top and watch that later on. And then next week is the final webinar of the series. And in that webinar, we're going to have discussions with a social justice artist, a director within local government, and a community engagement specialist. And that webinar is accompanied by an interview with disability rights activist Judy Human. So if you haven't checked out those videos, or if you missed the last webinar and want to register for the next one, be sure to visit our website or that short link there at the top. So I want to go through a few housekeeping items. Anthony, if you'll take us to the next slide, you'll see just a few things. If you've got questions or you need help with technical assistance, feel free to put that in the chat. As we go through today, you might have questions that you want to ask of the speakers. There's 2 ways to do this. You can put it in the chat, or you can click the bottom of your screen, Q&A, and you can pose those questions there. After each presentation, after all the presentations, we'll have time for Q&A. So don't be disheartened if you don't hear the answer right away. We'll be sure to get to that in the Q&A portion. And then, like I mentioned, the full recording will be posted online in the coming days. We definitely encourage you to share that with your networks. So without further ado, I want to introduce you to our moderator, Mohammed Naeem. Mohammed is the Senior Manager for Strategy and Partnerships at the Center for Inclusion, guiding the direction, facilitation, and building of its programmatic portfolios. The center houses the signature culture and narrative change strategies of the American Immigration Council. Previously, Mohammed worked at More in Common, where he led initiatives and partnerships with a wide variety of civil society groups, philanthropy, and media, in addition to launching landmark research projects and associated communications strategies. Mohammed's been a key partner on our Belonging Begins With Us initiative and brings just a plethora of knowledge and passion to this conversation on belonging. And I know that you will enjoy hearing from him. So Mohammed, I will pass it to you to introduce the rest of the speakers and get us kicked off on today's conversation.
All right, thank you, Jordan, for such a warm introduction. And thank you to Welcoming America for hosting such an important, critical, and timely conversation. I just wanted to extend a warm thank you to all of you, our attendees, for joining us today. Just at the outset here, the work of strengthening our country and our communities begins with each of you, the folks on the ground who are often closest to the solutions that our country needs to build a stronger, more vibrant, and more inclusive democracy. And our panelists today embody every bit of that work, have been leading every bit of that work, and embody the values and the principles of becoming a whole and inclusive democracy. So I'd like to introduce Jennifer Bailey. Jen, named one of 15 faith leaders to watch by the Center for American Progress. Reverend Jen Bailey is an ordained minister, public theologian, and a national leader in the multi-faith movement for justice. She's the founder and executive director of Faith Matters Network, co-founder of the People's Supper, and author of To My Beloveds, Letters on Faith, Race, Loss, and Radical Hope. Reverend Bailey is ordained in the African Methodist Episcopal Church. Welcome, Jennifer Bailey. Next, I'd like to introduce to you Cara Gabre, is the founder and program director of Refugee and Immigrant Services and Education, a nonprofit organization based in Noel, Missouri. Through both personal and educational investment, Cara has become a respected member by the refugee community in Noel, Missouri. She understood the needs of the refugees went far beyond the adult English classroom where she was teaching, and the idea for RAISE was birthed there. Cara's passion is to empower refugees and immigrants of all ages and nationalities to achieve social and economic independence and to live with dignity. As this is only possible through community integration, RAISE engages the local community as well as refugees and immigrants. She has a master's of education in teaching English to speakers of other languages. Welcome, Cara. Lastly, but certainly not least, is Emily Baird Chrisahan. Emily is the narrative and engagement manager with the Tennessee Immigrant and Refugee Rights Coalition. Emily leads a proactive campaign which seeks to create spaces for constructive dialogue on immigration in the hopes of moving Tennessee residents towards more pro-immigrant sentiments and active engagement. She leads TIRRC's Welcoming Tennessee initiative, deep canvassing work, Faith Leader Network, as well as other narrative change efforts. Emily moved to Nashville to attend Vanderbilt Divinity School, where she earned a Master's of Divinity with a certificate in religion in the arts and contemporary culture. Prior to joining TIRRC staff in April of 2018, Emily was the regional organizer with Religions for Peace USA and director of A Seat at the Table, Knoxville. Welcome, Emily. And so without further ado, I'd like to pass it, next slide. Without further ado, I'd like to pass it over to Jen Bailey, who will begin our first of 3 presentations. Jen, over to you.
Well, thank you so much, everyone, for joining us this afternoon, wherever you are. It's such a great honor to be on this webinar with 2 prolific leaders from across the country. I'm here today to share a little bit about my experience with the People's Supper, a project that I co-founded in 2017. So I've spent the past 4 years making a habit out of having dinner with strangers. There was the Chicana elder who labored with her family of migrant farm workers under harsh conditions in California's fruit orchards in the 1960s, for wages that were often withheld or outright stolen. There was the conservative pastor from rural North Carolina who shared openly about his father's alcoholism and abuse. There was the college senior, a refugee from Somalia, who could not fathom the entitlement and ingratitude of his peers who complained about the options in the dining hall. Each story was sacred. Each personal account taught me a little bit more about the rich strands of experience that make up the American narrative. And I am grateful for the time I invested in those tables. I believe that the great question of the 21st century is the question of how we be together, not how we are together or how we relate to one another, but how our very state of being, our essence, touches one another and learns to thrive in a state of interdependence. Our suppers served as an important counterpoint to the broader public narrative of division that continues to unfold in the American imagination. The People's Supper was the context for those suppers. Next slide. We were an initiative that began in January of 2017. And we use shared meals as a means of building trust and connection among people of different identities and backgrounds and perspectives. Since late 2016, we've helped power over 2,000 suppers across the country with partners including the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, Righteous Persons Foundation, USC Edge Center, the Mayor's Office of Erie, Pennsylvania, and more. And our work is really born of the belief, building on that famous quote from Stephen Covey, that indeed relationships move at the speed of trust. But when we talk about notions of interpersonal belonging and connection, it's really that social change moves at the speed of relationships. As we find ourselves in a time of deep division, the question then becomes, how do we get back to the art of connection on that individual level so that we might build up the resources and the tools and connections that can withstand some of the great crises, whether we're talking about climate change or the threat to our current democracy. That work of deep relationship building has to be at the core, and trust building has to be at the core. And so we really asked two big questions in our work. One, building from one of our mentors, Mama Ruby Sales, where does it hurt? Because we found in this work across the country that generally, when there is a moment of disruption or despair, or if there is an example of communities not being able to really get along, there's some core wound there that needs attention. And the second question that has become core to our work is the question of what needs healing here. And so for the next few minutes, I'm just going to share two examples of the work that we've done, two specific partnerships that emerged out of the People's Supper that I think might be helpful and instructive for us as we think about this question that's before us on the webinar today. Next slide. So in 2017, USA Today ranked Erie, Pennsylvania, the worst place in America for African Americans to live. That was grounded in the experience of decades of displacement and disinvestment from Black communities in Erie. And we got a call at the People's Supper, gosh, about a year later, from some of the partners in the mayor's office there and Erie Insurance, which is the largest Fortune 500, the only Fortune 500 company in Erie. And they were asking the question, what would it mean for us to begin interrogating what the conditions are that make people feel like they don't belong here in Erie? Given that we've never really done the work of having these cross-cultural conversations on a citywide level, could the People's Supper come in and help us build some relationships of trust across some key stakeholders in the community? So over the course of 6 months, we convened a small working group of about 5 people to help direct a larger working group of about 60 people, who then became the first people to try out this People's Supper model and build trust. So we did a series of 6 suppers in affinity groups. One supper was focused on bringing together all these groups to ask the core question, what is it that makes you call Erie home, and what do you love about being here as a baseline? After that first bridging supper, we broke people into racial affinity groups: African Americans, white folks, folks from the Hispanic and Latino community, other folks from who are new Americans, to ask very specific questions about what their experience in Erie was like. What did it mean to be and inhabit their bodies in their community, within their communities in the city of Erie? What came up in those conversations was a deep desire to begin working together to solve some of the common challenges around access to education and good jobs. After those affinity suppers, we then reconvened those groups to have a series of conversations to envision what it would look like to truly live into the mission of the mayor's office of being a community where everyone felt a sense of belonging. And something astounding happened over those 6 months, y'all. Through these suppers and through these dinners, people started to build relationships where relationships hadn't existed previously. Folks started to dream together and think together about how they might be able to have a positive impact on their community. And so at the end of our People Supper process with the mayor's office in Erie, Pennsylvania, a few new initiatives emerged organically from those relationships. They launched a small business incubator program for new Americans and BIPOC communities in Erie. There was a launching of the Erie Promise Scholarship, a promise fund to ensure all Erie students have access to higher education. A language access program that to date has led cultural competency trainings for the fire department, police department, and all public employees. And the city is in the process of hiring their first DEI consultant. And so I don't think that the People's Supper was just this magical thing that dropped in, but what the People's Supper allowed people to do was have the opportunity to share stories and start to imagine together, based on the particularity of their own experiences, the interventions that could be put into place to help transform Erie into a place that really reflected the diversity of their communities. Next slide. The second case study that I want to share with you all this afternoon is from a program that my organization, Faith Matters Network, led in North Carolina called Disciples of Welcome. The goal of that program over the course of 24 months was to support North Carolina in becoming a national model for social healing by catalyzing pastors as systems change agents that embody an alternative to some of the ruptures that dominate our culture from politics to the pews. It was a 24-month program that used the People Supper methodology as a means to engage and build relationship both within our cohort and within the congregations that those pastors we engaged led. 50 United Methodist clergy participated from across the state of North Carolina, but most of them were serving about 60% in rural context. Now, our program launched in 2019 and led into 2020, a year in which we anticipated both the presidential election, with North Carolina being a swing state. The United Methodist denomination is a period of discernment around whether or not they will continue to be one denomination because of some differences theologically around LGBT issues and gender issues. And in general, the tension that can be felt between rural and urban communities. So needless to say, the pastors who are engaged in our program were facing a lot of questions about what it meant to bridge divides in their local communities and inhabit, in our language, an ethic of radical hospitality in their communities. And what's interesting is that we also had a pandemic. And so we anticipated doing all these great people suppers over the course of 2 years in person, but because of the pandemic, we had to shift our model a little bit to be able to host and convene these pastors and deepen relationships with them virtually, as well as prior to the pandemic in person. And I just wanted to offer up one example of radical hospitality in action from one of our pastors in the cohort, Reverend Benny Oakes, who lives in Elizabeth City, North Carolina, where he pastors First United Methodist Church. Now, Benny came to Disciples of Welcome with a set of questions that around what it means to bridge racial divides in a community that has a long history and legacy of racial divisions. Through the People's Supper and through Disciples of Welcome, Benny learned about the People's Supper methodology and began to reach out to local pastors in his community, including Reverend Javen Leach. Reverend Javen Leach is a pastor in the AME Zion Church, a historically Black church there in town. And they began to have conversations with one another about their own spiritual journeys and build a friendship. So when the opportunity came to host People's Suppers in their town of Elizabeth City, Reverend Javen and Reverend Benny jumped at the chance and began to host suppers, bridging their congregations together and having deep conversations about racial divides, but also what it meant to be followers of Jesus in their context. I mention this example because almost a year and a half later, Elizabeth City, North Carolina was in the news following the Derek Chauvin trial after the death and murder of George Floyd, because it was the first city after that trial and that verdict was handed down where there was a police shooting of an unarmed African-American man. Now, in many communities, that means that, tragedy happens or something, in the words of some of my dear colleagues, pops off. And people are scrambling to know who to call or what to do. In this case, Reverend Benny and Reverend Javen had already established a deep and abiding friendship, and their congregations had gotten to know one another. So rather than turn into a powder keg, Elizabeth City became a national model for people coming together, especially across faith traditions and racial lines, to surround their community in a sense of love. They did prayer walks, they supported local organizers. And all of that was possible, according to Reverend Javen, because through that People's Supper process, they had established trust before tragedy. And so often when we talk about bridging interpersonal divides, we want to build a bridge in the middle of a storm. And so by establishing that trust before the tragedy, Elizabeth City really became a national model for what it means to do the deep work ahead of time to build relationships and hold one's community well. And the People's Supper was just part of that story. And so I lift up those two examples from Erie and from Elizabeth City, North Carolina, as examples of how relationship building at its core is the key, I would say the secret sauce of bridging work. And I look so forward to continuing to share with you in the Q&A some of the lessons that we've learned. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you for that, Jen. For such powerful reminders of what a supper, or rather a meal, or really joining one another around a table can do to influence and shape the relationships that we build in community, as well as with family and friends. So thank you for that. I'm looking forward to the Q&A as well. Next up, you have Kara Gabre. Kara, please take it away.
Hi, so Refugee and Immigrant Services and Education, or RAISE for short, was founded in Knoll, Missouri to help refugees and immigrants access services already available in the community to acculturate and to live with dignity. But first, a little background on Knoll. Knoll is in far southwest Missouri in a county bordering Arkansas and Oklahoma. The area is known for tourists floating and camping along the rivers. In the winter, Knoll is known as the Christmas City, Noel. The population of Knoll has grown to a whopping 1,800 or so with the arrival of poultry processing plants in the area. Virtually all of the increase is from limited English-speaking refugees and immigrants. Next slide. The ethnicities in Knoll are Latino, Pacific Islanders, Somali, Burmese, Karen, and Sudanese, and of course the long-term local population. Next slide. RAISE recognizes that refugees and immigrants need the local community in order to fully integrate and belong. With the grant from Welcoming America during COVID, RAISE started a community garden to provide opportunities for refugees and immigrants and the local community to interact in socially distanced ways in the fresh outdoor air. RAISE partners with the Knoll Housing Authority, which provides land and water for the garden. Raise also partners with the University of Missouri Extension, whose master gardener has provided much insight and direction, and whose nutritionist regularly demonstrates at the garden events by cooking recipes with garden produce. Raise continued the garden this year with the support of the American Immigration Council and gardening know-how. And we are also grateful for the Walmart's Foundation for the funding from last year. Some of the things that are necessary to start the garden were, the community partner that would donate the land. So the Housing Authority had 3/4 of an acre that they owned, 3 housing lots that didn't have houses. And this land was directly across from the largest neighborhood of homes in Knoll. The Housing Authority has 100 rentals. 40% of them are occupied by refugees and immigrants. 60% are income-based rentals. And this also includes senior housing. We also needed the support from an agriculturalist. So the University of Missouri Extension did a soil analysis for us at no charge to determine what should be grown there. And they also helped sketch out where different things should be grown, what fertilizer should be used, where fruit trees should be planted. This was not our area of knowledge by any means. And so we were grateful for their support. We had local help to help prepare the garden, and we had funding for tools, trees, plants, and labor. And we also needed to have a way to recruit volunteers. And while newspaper articles were written and flyers were distributed, and we had stuff on our Facebook page, what we learned quickly is the main way to get volunteers was through word of mouth and personal invitation. Next slide. Garden events are more popular and fun than the weekly grind of planting and watering and weeding. So this year we hosted more events. We did about 1 event per month during the growing season. These pictures are of roasting stuffed spicy jalapeno peppers. It made me cry, but they loved it. And we don't choose our activities for our benefit, but for what helps people feel a sense of belonging together. And the Karen kids and the Latino kids, they all loved the spice. So yeah, next slide. Early in the growing season this year, we had a shed raising and potato feed event. And we've learned through experience that even if you have a great multicultural group with good intentions, if the project is too challenging for the size of the group, it creates frustration instead of drawing people together. These guys persevered to finish the shed, although it took us 2 days. And amazingly, they've continued to talk in days since. Some level of challenge definitely causes the team to be interdependent, but too great of a challenge leaves frustration as the lasting memory. So choose your projects carefully or ensure that you have an adequate number of volunteers. Next slide. At every event, anyone volunteering or watering with watering and weeding or just attending the event has the opportunity to take produce and herbs home. And then Raise donates the rest of the harvest to a local food pantry operated by a local church. Next slide. Our final event of the season this year had our highest attendance ever. 99 people signed in. And for a city with a population around 1,800, we were very pleased with 99. Next slide. Raise learned from last year's events that in order for adults to interact with other adults with enough depth to create empathy, children's activities were essential. So this year we built a sandbox at an event earlier in the season, and the extension donated a large picnic table that we positioned in the shady area near the sandbox. We provided lots of kid-friendly games at events this year. And so the kids burned up energy together. They were all in mixed multicultural groups for these games, but that seemed so natural for the kids. And then it allowed the adults that came with a little more history and background to then focus on their interactions without too much distraction from the children. Next slide. We had the adults work in teams. So learning from our experience last year, this year we told specific volunteers in advance that we would be giving gift cards to thank them for taking on certain responsibilities. This helped to ensure the participation of every ethnic group, and Raise anticipated that they would then bring their friends and family with them. So we asked them to lead certain activities such as cooking or setting up tables and games, leading the games or more cooking. There were lots of cooking teams. We have had and will continue to grow okra at the garden every year. It seems like every event that we have includes okra recipes. At the Harvest Festival, we had a Sudanese woman plan an okra dish, but then we arranged the teams to help her so that individuals of other ethnicities could learn from her as they helped her to harvest, cut, prepare, and cook the dish, all on the garden site. However, we elevated her status to leader, and then the others willingly learned from her. We learned from last year that if the dominant population is doing all of the leading and arranging of things, that the other populations don't participate quite as much. So elevating her status ensured that everyone participated, and giving the laughter that was overheard. It seemed to be a successful interaction, and the food tasted great too. Next slide. Another team at the Harvest Festival prepared lamb. A word of caution: if you're working with Muslims, don't prepare meals with pork. For this gentleman, we asked him to lead lamb preparation, and it was great to see it done in his way. We didn't tell him what to do. We just asked him to lead it, and he came with his own ideas, and we loved that. So some of the takeaways that we have, first from last year being our first year with the garden, is to have the kickoff day on the day of the citywide yard sale, as that increased the publicity and awareness, especially from people from oral backgrounds. We learned last year that we needed to install raised garden beds for easier access for wheelchair and senior participation. So we did that this year. And then, of course, we know always to have plenty of ice water, Gatorade drinks, Freezy Pops, and canopies, because it's just hot down here. Some other lessons that we've learned is we really need to have community champions. So somebody to consistently reach out to the different communities. They've got that connection, and then they draw them in to the intercultural volunteer work in the community garden. So one community, the Burmese Karen, they already have a community garden on a different end of town, and they weren't very interested in working with the raised garden. It wasn't convenient for them location-wise. They didn't need the harvest. We did get some of the youth for that spicy pepper event, but otherwise we're going to have to keep working on another way to draw them in. We had one real community champion with the Sudanese, but right now the focus is on improving employment opportunities and developing some materials for future refugees and immigrants to have that same benefit. So this year, the Sudanese men didn't help in the garden on a weekly basis like they did last year, but they did attend all of the events. The wives and children, however, did stop through the garden to play in the sandbox, to munch on mint or gather herbs to take home. And for the kids loved watering the plants and playing in the resulting sprinkler. We found that it was very helpful to ensure at least one volunteer participant per community by giving them a gift card and then hoping that they would invite others from their community to come to the event. We've learned that location is key. With the garden being within walking distance of low-income housing, it was more likely that local participants with food insecurity would participate in the not so fun watering, weeding, and harvesting on a regular basis. And we've also learned just to keep pressing on. Every year we get more connection and trust with the local community. It's not at the pace we'd like, but little by little, community involvement grows, providing increased interactions between the different groups. And I will turn it back to Mohammed.
That was so great. Thank you so much, Kara. It's heartening to see that something as sort of small, but also very productive, in fact, like a community garden, can help organize and galvanize interpersonal relationships in the rural setting. We often forget that much of this country is rural, not urban. And so projects like yours and the learnings from those projects can have an enormous impact on the broader field into how we do this work in other parts of the country. So Last but certainly not least, let me pass it over to Emily for the final presentation.
Thank you, Mohammed, and everyone. I'm so grateful to be here with you all today. I work for the Tennessee Immigrant and Refugee Rights Coalition, also known as TURC, and today I'm going to share a little bit about a tactic that we call deep canvassing and how it's been successful in some of our campaigns at TURC. Deep canvassing is a tool to reach voters door to door, but I think there's a lot for us to learn in deep canvassing that can impact how we engage with others in our everyday lives. You can go to the next slide. Across the country, people in power are using racism, xenophobia, and fear of undocumented immigrants to win their elections and ignite their supporters. This probably doesn't come as a surprise to any of us on the call today that this is happening. Fear is a powerful emotion. So in response to fear, we need to find an equally strong way of engaging people's better instincts and desires. And what we know is that when combating fear, facts do not work. I really wish they did. Like, I wish that I could just hand someone a fact sheet on immigration and they would just become more supportive. But it's not how people work. We instead make decisions based on our emotions. So in order to affect that decision-making, we have to tap into emotion rather than pure logic. And deep canvassing offers us a way to do this. You can go to the next slide. So what exactly is deep canvassing? Instead of garnering support for a policy or a candidate like traditional canvassing might, deep canvassing seeks to understand someone's overall views on an issue. In our conversations with voters, we're looking to learn how they feel about immigration, and we're also hoping that by giving voters space to process their concerns and thoughts, that we can move them to have more supportive views. You can go to the next slide. In 2018, TURC was part of a project called the Immigration Strategic Messaging Project. And it showed for the first time that deep canvassing can move voters on immigration in statistically significant amounts. This experiment involved 2 other cities in California and a research team and the New Conversations Initiative. The research team conducted pre and post surveys that allowed us to scientifically measure people's movement over time. And what we learned was really exciting. Voters moved at a rate of about 8%. And elections are won and lost by much smaller percentages. So this is really a hugely significant number. We also found that these results are lasting a year later. So deep canvassing basically inoculates individuals to further hateful messaging. Not only did people stay moved, but they also moved people in their households. So when you think about the ripple effect one conversation can have, it's really encouraging. We had started our second phase of canvassing when a tornado tore through downtown Nashville and then COVID hit. So we were really sad to no longer be on the doors, but this gave us an opportunity to test if deep canvassing could work over the phones. And what we found is that over the phones, deep canvassing, our movement rate went from an already meaningful 8% to a really incredible 20%. So if you were nervous like I was that this technique cannot transfer over the phone, we learned that it indeed can. You can go to the next slide. So what makes a deep canvassing conversation so successful? There are several components that we think are really important, and there are 3 main pieces that I want to talk to you about today. This is the power of story sharing, the value of compassion, and the act of being heard. Through deep canvassing, I've really come to believe that the radical act of being heard is central to a successful canvass. And I say radical because to be truly heard and seen in a non-judgmental space is really radical. It might be difficult to think about the last time that's happened for us. It's just not something that happens every day. So to be met with a non-judgmental and curious attitude is really disarming. So it creates the environment for a productive conversation. And something that's important to remember here is that to express an understanding of what the voter is saying is not necessarily to confirm their beliefs. You can reflectively show that you've listened and understand the thoughts of a person with whom you're speaking without necessarily agreeing or confirming with everything that they say. So helpful things to show this active listening are, so I hear you saying blank, or it seems like blank is really important to you. And we know that this is not easy at first, so it does take some practice. Story sharing is the next important part of the conversation. A lot of times people are intimidated to enter these conversations because they feel that they don't know enough about the topic at hand. But the good news is that you do not have to be a policy expert to be successful in these conversations. So movement doesn't require a sophisticated understanding of the issue at hand or a perfect set of talking points. Sharing your personal story and the story of a loved one while listening to the story of the person with whom you're speaking is going to be a lot more effective. And we know that this requires a lot of bravery. What we've learned on the doors is that we have to be willing to mirror the vulnerability that we want to receive. And finally, there's the value of compassion. The value of compassion is something that voters really connected with. So our question to voters was, when was a time when someone showed you compassion when you really needed it? Implementing this question into our conversations was a breakthrough moment for us. It helped bring voters to a place where they could better empathize with the undocumented immigrants in their communities. You can go to the next slide. So here is the basic outline of what a deep canvassing conversation looks like. The first thing we want to do in these conversations is we want to get out the concerns. In these conversations, we really want people to voice their concerns because it's really the only way that people can move beyond them. There's a study by Unbound that was released a few years ago, and it suggests that supporters of the immigrant rights movement is a smaller group than we think. Basically, those who are more likely to vote progressively on other issues are not necessarily with us on immigration. And this is most likely because a lot of these individuals still hold conflicting views about immigration, but they never voice them. So generally, if someone never voices their concerns, it makes it really challenging to move beyond them. And in deep canvassing, we use a scale that you can see here at the bottom when we're asking where someone falls on an issue. This is really helpful because people are not usually completely for or against something. People usually hold complicated opinions, and this scale can really help with those complexities. So after we get out the concerns, we then move quickly into the story exchange section of the script. So by focusing on stories, we're inviting people into a more emotional and empathetic space by focusing on lived experience rather than abstract talking points. Then once someone is in this more emotive space, it becomes much more productive to go back and address those concerns from the beginning of the conversation. Here we're going to ask more follow-up questions and maybe offer one helpful fact. Again, we don't want to go overboard with the facts, and we're deep into the conversation before we ever share this fact. And then at the end, we're going to conclude the conversation by bringing things back to compassion, because it's really all about compassion. You can go to the next slide. So I just wanted to share a few key learnings from deep canvassing. The first is that this way of entering into conversations takes practice. It's really not intuitive. I know a lot of time these principles seem really straightforward, but when you think about how we typically converse with people, it's not always natural. We're usually conditioned to think about how to best make our point or argue a fact. But being vulnerable and participating in true active listening actually takes a lot of practice. The next point I'd like to share is that whether a person moves actually really has very little to do with us as canvassers. And it took me a while of canvassing before I realized this, that to be honest, it came as a bit of relief to me that there's no magical phrase that's going to move anyone. So our job as a canvasser is to be present and to ask really good questions and to show active listening skills. Our job is to be willing to undergo and sit in the intimidating conversations and difficult moments with a non-anxious presence. But at the end of the day, whether that person you're speaking to moves is going to be up to them. The next learning is that silence is okay. We often feel a need to fill that silence, but silence can give the person with whom we're speaking time to process. The next point is that this approach can be transformational for both parties. Canvassers often remarked about how they were changed in the conversation. It might be that they had a preconception about the voter that underwent transformation while they were speaking to them as well. The next point is that movement is more lasting if someone participates in their own movement. And what I mean by this is that oftentimes during these deep canvassing conversations, voters actually end up moving themselves just by being asked good questions. When you think about it, we don't often take time to process how we fully feel about something. So when given the space to do so, a lot of times people will talk themselves into a different viewpoint. The next is that we have to stop making assumptions about who and who isn't movable. Through deep canvassing, we've learned that few people are completely immovable, though this does happen, of course. Most people are movable given the right circumstances. And then we have to be genuinely curious with our questions. So asking questions is all about the tone in which we ask them. We need to bring a sense of curiosity to the conversation. It's not helpful to ask a question to make a point. We all know what that sounds like, and it's not helpful or productive in these conversations. You can go to the last slide. I do want to mention that when talking about deep canvassing, I always think it's important to bring up that this work is so rewarding, but it's also very vulnerable work. And vulnerability is something that we want to share with voters, but I always want to emphasize in our canvassing team that physical and emotional safety is also really important. And canvassers' experiences will be affected by one's embodiment. So a white male's experience and safety level is going to look a lot different than a female person of color. And for a person directly affected by the issue being discussed, the emotional toll is going to be greater. So these are just things that are important to pay attention to so that we are supporting each other in this work. And in conclusion, I'll just say that when it comes to challenging topics, it sometimes seems that a lot of people feel like you either need to ignore the discussion completely, or you need to come armed with your talking points, like ready to prove a point and win the argument. And neither of these ways is really truly helpful if our goal is actual change. So I think the tactics of deep canvassing can offer us another way. It offers us a way to have important and needed conversations in a productive way without damaging relationships along the way. So yes, deep canvassing is a voter engagement tactic, but I think at its heart, this work is really answering the question of how do we create an environment where change is possible? And what we see through deep canvassing is that we can't bring someone out of othering by othering them. Deep canvassing allows us to create the possibility for moving people towards more open and compassionate views by offering them this openness and compassion. So I will leave it there for now, but I'm really excited for the Q&A and to talk with all of you some more.
Thank you so much for that, Emily. It's important to recognize, and thank you for lifting the technical proficiencies that we all need to be able to have much better, more authentic, empathetic conversations. So looking forward to the Q&A myself. That concludes our presentation section of today's event. So Anthony, could you please place all of our, thank you. So if all the panelists could come on screen, that would be fantastic. Awesome. Well, thank you, everyone. I know from suppers to like deliberative dialogues to community gardens, you know, we've seen sort of the full spectrum of the activity that you all are doing in order to build more inclusive societies. There are some questions from our audience. Let's go. So Kara, there was a question sort of directed towards you, specifically, like, do you think the participants will eventually be able to take over the organizing and planning of these activities in sort of the weeks and months and years ahead?
Yes, that would be our hope. Right now it's on mixed teams that make the decisions. Okay. So everybody has a voice in it, but the staff is still raised people that we'd love to be able to hire one of them to take it on, or just to even run it without any paid staff. I mean, it's very possible that it's time to move into that. Right. Just let the teams run with it.
Yeah. Okay. And Emily, there was a question, how does deep canvassing foster belonging for those who might not support immigrants or who don't support immigrants, if at all?
Yeah, I mean, that is really who we're looking to talk to when we have these conversations. I mean, we are looking to talk to people who we would say are conflicted on immigration, or on that scale, talking to someone who's a 5 from 0 to 10 is great, but we talk to plenty of people who would rate themselves as a 0. And that is, part of this work. And part of the work is learning how to find moments of connection and bring them in to the story, and use deep listening to hear their lived experience, because that is going to bring someone to a place where they're so much more likely to then hear our experience, and we're sharing with them. And, obviously we're hoping that someone moves to be more supportive, but at the end of the day, it's also about, are we creating moments of listening, and are we actively deep listening to them? And it's amazing sometimes, even if that individual, we have a lot of people who say they're 0s and they move all the time. But if that person doesn't move, sometimes it's still like an emotional connection is still really important. So a lot of times we'll have someone who was maybe, a 2 or 3, and maybe they didn't move, but they actually thanked us for the conversation. They were really grateful that they could have this type of conversation with someone who had a different viewpoint in this, sort of emotive, active listening space.
Okay. I mean, there's a sort of a follow-up question to that from Shari. Can you provide an example of how you all offer stories about immigrants, especially for someone who's not so open to immigrants themselves?
Yeah. So we start by asking the person just if they know someone who's an immigrant. And most people do. Sometimes we need to help. We'll say like a coworker, a friend of the friend, but most people do. Most people know someone who's migrated to this country. And so we ask them to share a little bit about that person. And if they don't know someone, we might say, well, is there a coworker, or what have you learned about immigration in your lifetime in school or whatever? So we can enter the conversation that way. But like I said, most people really do know someone. And so we'll ask them, like, how is that person doing? Do you know the documentation status of that person? What has that person been through? Like, how are they feeling? So really, like, we want to know these, again, lived experience, right? And so when we enter a conversation that way through story, it helps someone see that they're actually more connected to this issue than they realize. And we want to humanize the issue, right? It's not an abstract talking point. Like, we're talking about the person down the street. We're talking about the person who works beside you, but maybe we haven't thought about the issue in that way. So we want to get that person into that space. And then we're going to then share our story about someone we know who have immigrated. And we have canvassers who are immigrants themselves. So maybe we're sharing our personal story. Maybe we're sharing the story of our friend. And then again, sometimes if the person we're speaking to might not have engaged initially, then we might say, do you know someone with a story like that? And then usually at this point, someone has usually engaged with us on that question. And then the second story we share is this compassion story. The reason for that is that even if the immigration story might be about someone else, the compassion story is about you. So I, as a canvasser, am going to share a time when I really needed compassion and I received it. And then I'm going to ask the voter for this story. And most people are usually able to come up with a time in their life where they really needed compassion. And so what we're hoping to do through that is help people connect their stories with what it feels like to need compassion in your community. Yeah. And then from that, like, lead them to show, like, okay, isn't that what we want for everyone? Like, isn't that what we want for everyone to receive compassion? So we might not agree on like the politics or the policy, but can we agree that everyone deserves compassion? And that usually, again, even if we're on different spectrums with this person, that is usually a great starting point. And that's a way better starting point to a conversation than having conversation about fear and about policy, right? So that's where we try to start.
Right. I often have described this, at least to myself, as there are off ramps and there are on ramps, and different folks, are going to come onto the highway at different points and different stages. And so often meeting people where they are is one of the more tactically strategic ways to be able to have a more deep conversation. I'm going to go to Jen here. Part of what we know is that a lot of folks might know those who are different from them, say in this case, immigrants or refugees themselves, but don't have necessarily a personal relationship deep enough to be able to foster true interpersonal belonging. And suppers are such that it really is designed to be able to develop that deep relationship. Could you maybe help share a personal experience that you might have had in where it was just a profoundly sort of deeply meaningful supper and conversation where you really felt that things went a long way, and maybe also what some of the challenges were as part of that conversation?
Yeah, absolutely. So in my opening, I alluded to a supper that we hosted in North Carolina. It was a supper around the time of the 2018 midterm elections. And so we did a campaign called the Midterm 5, where we did 5 suppers in 5 purple places around the country in an attempt to bring together people on the right and the left in conversation with one another. Now, by design, we didn't tell people who was on the right and who was on the left or who was in the middle. But we knew that and assigned people intentionally to tables. And I can remember being at my table, the People Supper methodology, there's usually a table host. In this case, I was hosting the table. And there was a profound exchange between 2 folks I knew were on different sides of the political spectrum, because part of our model is asking these deep and open and honest questions to build on the work of the Center for Courage and Renewal, which we say is like a question you can't possibly know the answer to without listening to what the person who responds says. And so it was really interesting because our framework for that conversation was not to ask people about politics, but to ask them the question, describe a time recent or long since past when you were made to feel isolated, lonely, or shut out of community. And then we asked a follow-up question, which was, describe a time recent or long since past when you've been made to feel like you fully belong, were fully welcomed and fully seen. And what emerged from, on the one hand, this pretty conservative rural pastor from rural North Carolina and a young African-American organizer were shared stories around that first question of experiences of violence in the home, domestic violence in the home. That, I think the nature of the question let people get deep pretty quickly. And so even though these are 2 folks who I know gravely disagreed on policy differences, on everything from their opinions about activism and Black Lives Matter, they were able to make this connection around a shared experience of exclusion and violence in the home that went really deep, which was profoundly shifting in their kind of conceptions of one another. And so that's just one example that jumps to mind that really sticks out to me. I'll never forget sort of the tears that were emerging and the level of deep resonance they were experiencing. Now, I'm not saying every People Supper results in that type of very deep storytelling or heart opening. And I think one of the other things we're really intentional about is making sure people have resources after the supper to unpack, especially if it goes really deep. And so that's one example that came to mind for me.
Right. Yeah. I mean, often, starting where we're hurting is also a place where there is a lot of growth to be had. Right. And so it's a wonderful place, or really a wonderful way to sort of, when you organize around people's pain, there's something that's deeply moving and special about that. I've personally experienced that. When you mentioned that story, it hit me in a part where, was deeply moving. So thank you for sharing that. So like Kara, like I had mentioned, most of this country is rural. It's not urban. And so for those who are, who live in those sorts of settings or work in those spaces, what advice would you give folks who aren't sure where to start to potentially initiate a project like yours?
Well, we've noticed that, like in the rural areas, that the mindset is very limited. Like it's such a small worldview. And so it's hard to get people to interact. And so for us, we found it's got to be through personal invite. And so we follow the connections and we ask each person who comes to bring somebody else new. When we were planning this project initially, we brought together, we just reached out to a whole bunch of different organizations, the Housing Authority, different individuals who had land available. And we made a group decision about how to do this, what would be the best place. And we just tried to involve as many people as we could in the decision making. And then afterwards, just personal invitation.
Great. Thank you for that. And Emily, like, I'm wondering, like, similar to sort of what Jen had described, could you maybe share with us a story of a time where, you had a conversation or a canvassing that was deeply, or it had deeply moved someone, if not politically, certainly possibly emotionally?
Yeah, there are so many. I love this work because every time I lead a deep canvassing, I get to hear a story of transformation. I mean, maybe every time is really strong. Most every time I hear a story of transformation. And I love being able to support our canvassing team when we're debriefing. So I just feel like there's so many to share, but for some reason, the one that's coming to my mind today is one from the very beginning, back in 2018 when we started this project. And it's a story of our canvasser knocked on someone's door, came to the door. This person actually happened to be a refugee themselves. But we were canvassing around issues that affect undocumented community, actually workplace rates specifically. We've canvassed on a lot of different things, but this was the first thing we did was around workplace rates. And this individual, I think they were very low on the scale in support. They were, I think, maybe a 2 or a 3. So they were a refugee, but they were not very supportive of the undocumented community. And a lot of that had to do with some narratives that they were a part of and their community said about like doing things the right way, right? So they were low on this scale. And when having this conversation with them and then asking them to share their story of compassion, they just lit up. I mean, they were so excited to share. And what they shared was about just the time when they came to this country and they had a great experience. I know not everybody does, but this individual had a really good experience being connected with their community here, being supported, and they just shared story after story about what this was like for them and how much compassion they received. And our canvasser was then able to relate for that person and say, not everybody actually has a pathway to move here. That, this idea that you should get in line or things like that. There's not a line for everyone. There isn't a pathway for everyone. And so, our system really needs updating. But in the meantime, what are we going to do, right? How do we want to treat people in the meantime, right? It's about people are here, they're in our communities. How should they be treated? And recognizing that workplace rates create a ton of fear. We don't want people to live in fear. So this individual they went to a 10. They were like immediately able to see like, oh, you're right. Like, I don't want people to live in fear, right? I want people to receive compassion. And they hadn't thought about the fact that pathways like they had weren't open to everyone. And so we want those pathways to be open for everyone. So that's just a really good example that I can think of that comes to mind right now. But we do have a lot of transformative moments from people who are zeros or who are, not supportive of the immigrant community at all or don't have any connection. That also happens. I remember the story one canvasser told me about talking to someone that they were really, really nervous to approach their door. I think maybe they had some signs in the front yard that were just really intimidating. They were really, really nervous. They didn't want to knock on the door. And it ended up being one of the best conversations they'd had all week. This person was, again, really low on the scale, but they engaged with the conversation. They were present. This canvasser did a great job of active listening. And then at the end of the conversation, the person didn't move and the canvasser was kind of disheartened. And they walk back inside and the person walks away. And then before they get to the end of the driveway, the person opened the door, came back out and said, "Thank you for having this conversation with me today. You've given me a lot to think about." And so we know sometimes that even if someone says they don't move at the door, that we know actually from the data that people move later on. And so I feel like I could gush on and on about stories, but those are just a couple that come to mind today. So.
Yeah, I have to say, and this is just a personal story. I had been on a deep canvassing or a deep canvas I think in Lancaster, Pennsylvania. And there was a house I was walking up to, American flag planted up, I think the fellow had served in the Marines, so a lot of, sort of iconography related to the like Marines and sort of the war effort, specifically Vietnam. And it couldn't, and even though we disagreed specifically on the policy prescription, it was a very principled conversation, and I really appreciated that. And part of the work that I've done, both at the council as well as previously, has shown that people really rely on their personal instincts, but also want to be sort of left alone to have personal agency in making their choice. And I think that in a lot of ways, personal agency and creating space for that is really important in the context of building interpersonal belonging. So that is born out of the research, but certainly, sort of the work you're doing, I'm sure it comes across as well. So we'll go around, just one last question to each of you. If there was one takeaway that you'd want our audience to sort of leave with, what would that be? So let's start with Kara.
One takeaway would be just to get involved, whether it's in forming your own project like we did with the community garden, or whether it's joining some other organization's activity or something. Like, just don't be afraid to find people who are different from you and get to know them. And even if you just use it as a learning experience, and take other people with you. Like, everybody seems to have some fear, but if you're going along with somebody else who's already, started like, if I take somebody to visit a refugee who's never been to their house, they're more comfortable because they're with me. And so, like, whatever you do, just take somebody else with you.
Let's go to Jen.
Yeah, I just returned to that mantra that has been so central to the work of the People's Supper, which is this notion that, again, building on the work of Stephen Covey, that relationships move at the speed of trust, but social change moves at the speed of relationships. And for me, I think there are three questions that I would just leave you with as you're interrogating and thinking about your bridging work that have become really essential to me. As I've been thinking about, there was a question in the Q&A around like fatigue, and this work can be exhausting. And so whenever I think about approaching a bridging conversation or community, I ask the questions, what are we trying to bridge to? What are we bridging over? And what is our bridge made of? And so I'm thinking about then, what's the ultimate goal? What's the ideal future state that you're trying to get to through this collaboration? What are you bridging over? Meaning, what are some of the deep histories and wounds that might be present in the community that need not just to like be seen, but tended to? And then, of course, like, what's your bridge made of? And I think that's partially about, gathering those tools and techniques like deep listening, deep canvassing, things that we've talked about on the call and webinar today that really gird up our ability to withstand some of the weather, if you're going to work with that metaphor all the way. So I always say, like, if I'm doing deep bridging work, I don't want a bridge made of sticks. I want one made of steel or some other type of sustainable materials, right, that withstands the blow. And so I would just hold those three questions and offer them back to you all as you do this work.
Thank you for that sage advice, Jen. And Emily, lastly.
Yeah, I think while preparing for this presentation, like, I've been thinking a lot about deep canvassing and relationing to other and belonging, because that's obviously what we're talking about today. And it really occurred to me that while doing this deep canvassing work, I feel like what we're doing is kind of twofold. Like, we're speaking to voters because we obviously want to create communities and systems where migrant families are welcomed with dignity, like, period. Like, that's the main role in my work that I do. That's our goal. And to do this, for this to happen, like, we need for people to move out of mentalities and biases and practices that other immigrant communities, right? So that's why we're going to talk to people, because we need that to happen. But then there's the second layer of this canvassing work, is that we're seeking to truly listen to voters and to create spaces of connection with them at the doors. So basically, we're inviting individuals into spaces of belonging and hoping that by extending that space of belonging and compassion that then they can then extend that environment to others, right? So it's kind of like this 2 layering of belonging work that's going on. So I guess the simple answer to your question of what I would like to leave people with is that like active listening works. It's not just helpful. It's not just great for relation building, but it actually works. So we can do both, right? We can build communities that where everyone can belong. And then we can also use active listening to help everyone we're speaking to belong. We can do both because they are the same, like they result in the same thing. So like active listening works. So to just trust it and to lean into it. And it can be hard and really challenging, but to just trust it and lean into it.
Thank you for that, Emily. I just want to thank all of you, Emily, Jan, Kara, for such sage advice and for your sort of like just tremendous participation today. And as a reminder, this webinar has been recorded, and in the coming days, you all will receive a follow-up email with the link to the recording. Anthony's pulling up the slides just now. Please don't forget to watch the films and sign up for our next webinar. The 3rd webinar will take place on next Thursday, October 28th, at the same time, 2:30 p.m. Eastern, and we'll dive into structural othering. If you're looking to learn how environments, structures, and systems and other people, as well as promising practices from the field to dismantle and build new systems that work for everyone, then you won't want to miss next week's webinar. If you have any questions, please feel free to contact Jordan at welcomingamerica.org. And if you don't already, we encourage you to follow Welcome America online across social media to keep up with upcoming events. Thank you everyone for being here today. We'll see you next Thursday for our final webinar. Have a wonderful evening.